Okay, it's 11:05. Whitney and Liz, if y'all are ready, I think we can get started. Um, so thank you all so much for being here and joining us for our session on knowledge justice and advancing toward a community-driven sharing of scientific knowledge in sexual and reproductive health. It's a long title, but we are really excited to have y'all here to do some interactive discussion and learn from each other and kind of think about how we can make science and knowledge more just. So to get started, I think we're gonna introduce ourselves and I will let Whitney go first.
Hi, everyone. I'm Whitney Rice, and before I get into a self-introduction, just want to again echo Katie's thanks to all of you for joining us and for being with us on this morning of one of your weekend days. Before we get into the content, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all joining each other and sharing space today in the midst of quite heavy times for so many of us. Our team this morning in particular is grappling with recent tragedy, with ongoing ups and downs of managing chronic conditions, with a pandemic, with busy moments in our personal and professional lives. And we realize that that may be the case for so many of you as well. And we want to just make sure that you all know that we intend for this session to be interactive, but we also know that folks may be able to give as much as they're able to give to our conversation. And just again, want to thank you for sharing this space with us. So I am Whitney Rice. Again, I am a faculty member at Emory University in our School of Public Health in the Department of Behavioral, Social, and Health Education Sciences. And I also have the pleasure to direct the Center for Reproductive Health Research in the Southeast, which is a center that focuses on both, policy relevant research that seeks to advance access to sexual and reproductive health, but also partners with a number of different organizations and advocates and folks who are working in a variety of different reproductive health rights and justice spaces to do this work. And so we are just pleased to have a conversation that we have had internally for quite a bit of time in this broader space with you. One of the topics that we'll be talking about today frequently is just what it means to be and how you see yourselves as producers and consumers of information about sexual and reproductive health. And so I'm going to sort of begin our introductions with modeling how I think of myself as both a producer and consumer of sexual and reproductive health information. So as I mentioned, in my professional role, I certainly have a responsibility for producing sexual and reproductive health information related to studies, research that primarily examines social and behavioral issues in sexual and reproductive health, so stigma and how that has implications for people's use of sexual and reproductive health services. And oftentimes a part of my role is sharing back what findings may be from those studies, but I also have a role as in more of a teaching and educating space, and I'm often producing or sharing health information there. But I'm also a consumer of all of the work that you all may be doing in your reproductive health rights and justice work, but also as a personal patient who interacts with the healthcare system and needs to understand what understand some of my needs and experiences in the context of larger opportunities to engage within the healthcare system, take advantage of different testing, treatment, et cetera, needs. So those are just a few of the ways that I am involved as a consumer and producer of of sexual and reproductive health information, and we'll be talking about several others in Liz and Katie's example and further along. So I'll pass things over to Liz to introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Whitney. That's really an awesome intro to this conversation today, and great role modeling for all of us, of course, of how you're a knowledge producer and a consumer. So my name is Liz Mosley. I'm currently a postdoctoral research associate at Georgia State University. I also am collaborating with the Center for Reproductive Health Research in the Southeast that Whitney mentioned. Before coming to Georgia State, I was actually a postdoc there directly with Whitney and Katie at RISE, and now have the privilege of sort of expanding that work to include Georgia State. I am also a full spectrum doula, and so a lot of my sexual and reproductive health research is informed by my experiences as a doula, both as an abortion doula, bereavement doula, and a birth doula. And so I think of myself as often sitting at that intersection of knowledge production and consumption. As a researcher, that's kind of what my day job is to collect and analyze data. Most of my research is community engaged. I have the privilege of working closely with Sister Love on some projects. And so we do a lot of production of our own knowledge, but also as advocates and as a doula, I consume a lot of knowledge, especially from the reproductive justice world, in order to sort of use the facts and data that we have about sexual and reproductive health and social justice to really move that needle toward reproductive justice. And so again, kind of sit on both sides of that. But yeah, I'll leave it at that and can share more about my experiences as we go through today's presentation. And I'll pass it over to Katie.
Thanks so much, Liz and Whitney. Those are both great examples, and I think similar to kind of how I interact with knowledge production and consumption as well, certainly professionally. So my name is Katie Singh. I use she, her pronouns. I am the co-director of administration and community liaison at RISE, which is the Center for Reproductive Health Research in the Southeast at Emory. And so in that role, really a big bulk of my work is working with partners and with the community. And so that is a lot of reproductive health rights and justice organizations, a lot of the RJ folks who are participating in this conference. I have the privilege of working with them on a day-to-day basis, both as a producer of information, sharing the research that we're doing at the RISE Center, as well as a consumer, learning from them and their work and thinking about how we can work together and work synergistically to kind of achieve shared goals of improving reproductive health in the Southeast and in Georgia, which I think is similar to kind of what Liz and Whitney both mentioned, that as a researcher who wants to work with and engage with community partners, you have to kind of think of yourself as both a producer and a consumer of information. And a lot of that professional work kind of bleeds into the personal, where like friends and family who know that I work in this reproductive health rights and justice space will come to me with questions about policies, about things they've read in the news. And in that role, I am sort of a producer of information for my personal networks, kind of using the expertise that I've gained professionally and sharing it with personal networks. And then similarly, consuming information about policy changes, about reproductive health science and new developments from that lens of both the personal and professional as well. And so we want to invite y'all to start thinking about kind of those roles in your life as a producer and consumer of information. And we're going to be diving a little more deeply into that a little later on in this session. But right now, we would actually really like to learn about y'all. So we invite you to go into the chat, share your name, your pronouns, where you're logging in from. The three of us, as Emory and Georgia State folks, are logging in from Atlanta, Georgia. But we would love to learn and see kind of where folks are coming from. And then what brought you to this session? What interested you about this topic? How does it relate to your personal or professional life? And kind of, yeah, what brought you here to join us? And so please share these answers in the chat.
I'll add that we're monitoring both the Zoom chat and the chat in the WOVA app, so feel free to use whichever is most accessible to you.
Yes, thank you, Whitney.
Apparently my cat would like to introduce herself. Tybee.
I welcome that introduction.
Thank you so much for joining us, Inka. It's lovely to meet you.
We'll give it a moment or two in case anyone else. Hi, Isabella from Houston. Very nice to meet you as well.
Thank you all so much. These are really great responses. Hannah, welcome. You are right on about information and education being used to combat stigma. I know Whitney's research focuses a lot on that, so that's very cool.
Yeah, I think we've already heard a bit in the chat about how just powerful having access to information is, but it can also be harmful if our access is primarily to misinformation. But also there are some threads in the chat about just the usefulness of some of the social media and other forums for expanding our access to information, especially when it's informed by evidence. And I completely agree about how misinformation may also drive stigma, but we may be able to combat that, especially when community-driven perspectives may be elevated in that information that we access.
Yes, absolutely.
Also exciting that we're representing so many different areas of the US.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing. I think we're going to wrap up the intros and move on to a few sort of housekeeping and logistics pieces, and then get into the next part of the session. So quick overview of kind of how we're planning to use technology in this session. So as everyone can tell, right now we're starting with folks' audio muted. Video is optional throughout the whole session. As Whitney acknowledged at the beginning, we're all coming at this with from different perspectives in the midst of really challenging times. So whatever you're able to give, we welcome it. We do encourage folks to use the chat function throughout the session. We will be monitoring and welcome questions and other interactive discussion throughout. We will also be using some other tools to encourage interaction during the session, trying to make the most of our digital environment to still get the chance to interact and meet with folks, like Whitney said, kind of throughout the country, which is really cool. So we'll be using a Google Jamboard where you can kind of put sticky notes and share with your group, as well as a few polls. And then we will be having one part of our session in breakout rooms, and then other group discussions kind of throughout. And during some of those group discussions, we will allow folks the opportunity to unmute yourself, kind of using the raise hand function in Zoom, and welcome audio discussion as well, to kind of use different interactive pieces to engage with each other. In addition, we wanted to share some kind of ground rules for this discussion since it is going to be interactive. We know that Spark already provided some conference guidelines, which I think are kind of resonate with a lot of these rules. And so these are the rules that we came up with. And we wanted to ask folks if you have any additional kind of ground rules that you think would be helpful for an interactive discussion, please share them in the chat and we will honor them throughout this session. So we'll give you a minute if you have anything that you'd like to share with us. Any folks chiming in the chat? Whitney and Liz? All right. Well, if you think of anything, we invite you anytime, please share it in the chat. And again, we will honor that as part of our interactive space. But right now, we actually want to get the discussion started. So I'll hand it over to Liz to get things started.
Thanks so much, Katie. Yeah, so we thought that in honor, honestly, of knowledge justice, we wanted to begin the conversation with your own definitions of knowledge. And so feel free to put things in the chat. I think also there's like a small enough group of us that if you wanted to raise your hand and even unmute yourself and share that into the space, that would be fine. But when you think of the word knowledge, yeah, what comes to mind? How would you define that? I know it can be hard to get it started exactly on the first, like in the morning, on a weekend. Oh, I like this, Jordan. So Jordan has shared in the chat, I define knowledge as something powerful, factual through something you experience. It's incredibly spot on in how we've been conceptualizing this as well.
I love the centering of experience in that. It didn't necessarily require a particular source, but
yes.
But there is so much power in our experiences.
I like too that Jordan has described this as something powerful. And I think there's a lot of layers to that we can unpack around what does it mean for knowledge to be powerful. Of course, we can think about knowledge with groups of folks and different experiences. You can also think about knowledge and power over in a more inequitable way that power can be used. Already calling that into this space, I think, is very, very wise. We'll give folks about 15 more seconds just to see if other ideas pop up from what's already been offered. Louder than I expected, my little timekeeper for myself. I'd love to maybe advance to the next slide, Katie. I think that we have a few definitions that we'd like to offer and kind of hold up. So we, kind of think about knowledge very broadly. And so I wanted to first acknowledge that and start with that knowledge can be defined as facts, as information, or as skills. So knowledge about how to do things through experience, as Jordan has already said, or through education. So by proxy, through education. We can also think of knowledge as what's known about a particular field, kind of in total about a subject. So our knowledge about reproduction, or our knowledge about STIs. I know someone had called that out in the chat as an area we're particularly interested in learning about. We can also think of knowledge as awareness or familiarity with a topic that's gained through experience, or through a situation. And so again, Jordan kind of touched on all of these already. And then if we think of knowledge kind of broadly, there's of course philosophical definitions of that. There's ways to theorize about knowledge and what it means. For the purposes of today's conversation, we're really going to focus a bit more on science and research knowledge. And we define that as what we learn through the scientific process, which involves experimenting and or collecting data. So if you think back to the scientific method that maybe we learned in grade school, we think of scientific knowledge as the things that are derived through that process, which I want to acknowledge is a very specific type of knowledge, but one that we wanted to really focus on during today's conversation. So please keep expanding the conversation as needed, but wanted to just name that that's what we'll be focused on when we talk through the different models we use today. I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I know there's a lot to kind of chew on this slide right here, so I want to walk you through it pretty carefully. When we talk about knowledge justice, so this is the conceptual framework that we're using in our research and in today's presentation. And it's a framework that applies the principles of social justice in the environments of competing interests, specifically as they relate to knowledge. So I'll circle back to that and what it means to have competing interests. But as our group has already named, knowledge is not neutral. Knowledge is powerful, and power is rarely neutral, right? And so it can be used both to produce and reproduce social injustices, or if we use a more knowledge justice framework, then it can also be used to dismantle and unpack and mitigate social injustices. Who can be a legitimate knower, like who produces and owns knowledge, also called experts, versus whose knowledge counts and has been the subject, this has been the subject of much debate. And so what we can start with is kind of the left figure, the triangle kind of pyramid figure, is what we think of as our traditional knowledge paradigm, especially in the United States, in a very white-centric, white supremacist culture, where mainstream knowledge is kind of at the top. And you can see our spectrum on the left there is political power. And so traditionally, mainstream knowledge has this coveted position of being more powerful and literally having power over these other types of knowledge. So a hierarchy has been set up where experiential knowledge, which we've already named, right, as something very important, cultural knowledge, spiritual knowledge, these other ways of knowing that doesn't have to do with scientific processes or research, get devalued and delegitimized so that mainstream knowledge has power over those other ways of knowing. And so when we talk about competing interests, that's kind of what we mean. That if you think of power and privilege as something that is finite, that has to be competed for and set up in a hierarchy, as white supremacy tells us it is, then you end up with this kind of pyramid structure, a pyramid scheme if you want. And on the right, we have this other way of knowing. So the vision that we're offering is this framework called knowledge justice, which I want to name we did not develop. This has been around well before us, but it's one that we apply in our work and very much respect and lift up, is a more equitable approach to knowledge and thinking about how all of these types of knowing, experiential knowledge, cultural and spiritual knowledge, as well as mainstream kind of scientific knowledge, are given equal political power and legitimacy. So, and as many of you know, in anti-racist work and reproductive justice work, it's all about disrupting those hierarchies and creating equitable landscapes. And in this way, you're able to lift up and value other ways of knowing equally alongside things like scientific knowledge. Um, but of course, all of you are well aware, I'm sure, that that's not often the reality that we experience. I think we can go to the next slide now. So this is kind of a quote that we had from a session during the Let's Talk About Sex conference last year, when we were actually able to be in person together in Atlanta, sharing reproductive justice space with one another physically. And Katie and others facilitated this conversation about flipping the research paradigm. Oh, it was a great conference. Jordan is shouting out for LTAS. Yeah, oh, the best. We miss it. And one of the participants shared that research should involve building power in communities to collect, analyze, and use the data they see best fit, not just using data to do advocacy on the community's behalf. So I'll just let us sit with that, because I think that names that traditional paradigm, using data to do advocacy on the community's behalf. I can see that as the pyramid, right? That's that triangle where researchers are still seen as the bearers of knowledge, and they might bring that to community or do something on behalf of community, versus empowering and skill building with community so that they collect and analyze their own data and tell us what we're supposed to learn, right, as researchers, when I say us. And so we just wanted to lift up that quote as the beginning of this conversation, and sort of what brought us to the presentation here today. I think we can go to the next one. So I had mentioned that I'm someone who does community engaged research, and I think of that as a spectrum. And so a lot of you have probably been engaged in different types of research, whether you would call it that or not, where we can think of the left side of our continuum, so kind of on closer to where it says flipping the paradigm in our title. On the far left, we can think of that as maybe the traditional research that looks more like that triangle or that pyramid, where typically a research question is developed by researchers, data are collected and analyzed, and then maybe the findings are disseminated back to community if they're lucky, if we as community members are lucky to receive that information back. And then I think of the far right of this continuum as the opposite almost, where we've flipped the research paradigm and community members are driving the research questions. Folks who are most impacted by health issues are analyzing the data, collecting the data, even deciding what data need to be collected. And then that information is held in community, in context, and used to advocate from within. And so maybe to flesh these out a bit, I'd love to give some examples, and think about how do we figure out where our work fits on this continuum. So I became engaged in public health back in 2004 or 5, so doing more kind of clinical research. So through college, my family is really impacted by breast and ovarian cancer. And I wanted a way to kind of give back. So again, kind of at that time was more of a consumer of the knowledge, but wanted to be empowered to kind of contribute to that knowledge base. And so I sought out opportunities to do breast cancer research when I was in college. And I was drawn to it because they were looking at racial disparities in breast cancer and how different types of breast cancer impact different communities of color at higher rates, and with less access to treatment. But the type of research that was being done was this traditional model where researchers and clinicians at the hospital had ideas about genetic factors that underlined racial disparities in breast cancer. And that led them down this whole path of research about biological differences between racial groups with regards to breast cancer. And luckily, at the same time, I was getting a women's studies education and knew to push back on that, and that did not resonate with what I knew about social inequality and the fact that poverty and racism affect how people can or will access care. And so I think in my head of that's almost where I started with the kind of research that was very traditional, that I think wasn't asking the right questions, and that certainly wasn't improving the capability of Black communities in North Carolina to do their own research about environmental injustice and how that was affecting the kinds and the frequency of breast cancer that we were seeing. So you can kind of flash forward to today. I think one of the best honors of my career has been working with Sister Love, as I mentioned, on a medication abortion study here in Georgia. We call it GAMMA. There was a presentation yesterday about med abortion that my colleagues gave. So if you didn't have a chance to see it, I think it was recorded. So if you have questions about medication abortion and what it is, definitely go listen. But I'm excited because this has been a community-led study where Sister Love, as a community-based HIV and reproductive justice organization, came up with the research questions. They wanted to know, why are Black and Latinx women not able to access medication abortion as often as easily as white women here in Georgia? And so starting there, we've been able to build this study together where Sister Love and Black and Latinx communities in Atlanta lead the research. And then I kind of give technical assistance from the research side, helping them to know, how to go about collecting the data they want to get, teaching folks and through training with how to analyze qualitative data. And now they can do it on their own. So the next time around, Sister Love has and will already started like research projects where they continue to be the lead on these efforts, squarely as producers of knowledge. And I truly believe that that's producing the right kind of knowledge because we're now asking the right questions and we're building capacity within community who are most affected by these issues. And so in trying to figure out sort of where are we on this spectrum, whether you're a student who's thinking about a DRPH program, like I saw in the chat, ask yourself, as you are given opportunity to engage in research, what kind of research is this, right? Is this equitable or is this power over someone? And the questions I think you can ask to kind of help yourself gauge where on the continuum are you and where do you want to be are things like, whose needs does this research respond to? Who is leading this research? Who is receiving the funding? And I tell you, that's a really big piece of this. How are the decisions made in terms of the questions asked, the kind of data that are collected, how information is disseminated, who's making those decisions, and then who owns the results? Because so traditionally, we're collecting data from communities who never own those results, even though those are their stories, their biological samples. The research has been done on people rather than with folks. And then finally, how are the results disseminated? If things stay in academic journals, is that just? And is that knowledge being shared equitably with communities who need it and from whom it came? So just wanted to share that sort of framework and that spectrum of examples as ways that research can look. And I know that y'all are familiar with this, but sometimes it helps, I think, to even envision like, what could the alternative be? Because we so often see that traditional hierarchy. Okay, maybe the next slide now. Okay, so we've talked about sort of the framework and how it's defined. We've talked about what knowledge means to y'all. What does knowledge justice look like to you? Whether you've had specific examples or you're just imagining and envisioning something more equitable, feel free to drop some lines into the chat. You can unmute yourself if you want and speak it into the room. Raise your hand if you want, however you'd like to contribute. I'd love to hear your ideas. Oh my gosh, internet access for all. Excellent example, Jordan. We've definitely been talking about that a lot here in Georgia lately, and I'm sure in Tennessee as well, and all across from y'all, from places where y'all are coming from today. We've got, I don't know how to articulate it well, which is totally fine. All of us are doing our best, but it's having accessibility and acknowledging the positionality of researchers and the people who are distilling the knowledge. I'd love to come back to that issue of positionality because I think that is so powerful. We've got another example, knowledge justice as a way of disrupting the power structures that are so tied to knowledge as we know it. Oh my gosh, yes. So not just how do we produce knowledge, but how do we disrupt the power imbalances in the first place so that knowledge is inherently transformed. We've got some expectation setting and some collaborative and mutual agreements. Oh gosh, isn't that the truth? And I know Sophie, she's a detail-oriented person, so it doesn't surprise me that that's where her mind went. It's like, how do we enact this? And definitely expectation setting and transparent communication and agreement up front. Yes, again, transparency just came up actually. So transparency to where the information is coming from and why it's being put out. Absolutely. Like, what's the purpose of it? Hannah's offered, knowledge justice occurs when people are most impacted by an issue or involved in the production and the dissemination of information. Nothing about us without us. Oh gosh, yes. I think that is it in a nutshell. Nothing about us without us. Yep. And you're getting some claps for that for sure. Other folks lifting that up. Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, y'all have the wisdom. You've seen it. Absolutely. I love this issue of positionality because I don't think that we have explicitly called that out yet. But even in the beginning, I think Whitney kind of set that tone by saying that our professional and our personal selves are here today, and trying to acknowledge where we come from, what privileges we have, what disadvantages and maybe oppressed experiences we have, and owning that so that when someone like me, especially as a white woman, does knowledge production and I do research, without owning that privilege that I have, I think that it can be a dangerous game because you're not being cognizant or reflecting on how that knowledge production could be used as power over people. Inherently, us as academics, we're associated with Emory and Georgia State universities. That comes with a lot of power, and we have to acknowledge that. Bringing kind of our full selves into the picture, I think, helps others decide, is this information I should trust? Is this information that was collected in a way I believe in? All of that is very important. And we don't do it enough in research. I see it shifting, especially as we engage more with youth researchers who think about positionality so inherently, I think. I'm uplifted by the generation who's coming behind me, honestly, as I still learn from the generations who came before us. But I think positionality is a big piece of this, and just being clear, are you of the community, or are you with the community, or are you about to do something to the community? And I think positionality helps us really think through that. Awesome. So let's keep these examples in mind of knowledge justice as we continue to kind of move through the conversation today.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was just such a powerful discussion about knowledge justice, our own positionality, kind of where we sit in these different spaces. And hopefully now I'd like to build on that by going through some activities that will help us all think about our own positionality and kind of where do we sit on the continuum of knowledge production and knowledge consumption, and how can we, in our personal and professional roles, be empowered to enact knowledge justice kind of in our own work and our own lives. So we're going to go through some activities around different information pathways. First, thinking about ourselves as information consumers. So we want to start this section with actually a poll. So thank you, Whitney, for sharing that in the chat. So please, we invite you all to click that link to Poll Everywhere and share with us, where do you get new information about sexual and reproductive health? And the way the poll is set up, you can answer kind of multiple times. So you'll have to click individually for each different source. And we're excited to learn a little bit more about where you sit on this continuum of knowledge production and knowledge consumption. I'm going to pause the share and go to the poll results so that we can see them in real time. So
I also just shared the link in the HOVA app chat, so you should see the link both in Zoom and in HOVA.
right. Cool. We have, so it looks like a lot of social media. Yeah, definitely agree about that. I feel like it's the quickest way to get new information a lot of the time. But that's tied with internet/Google. Also really resonates. That's usually the first place I go when I want new information, is typing that question into Google. Family and friends, healthcare providers, a little bit traditional news, not so much from TV and movies, which I think is probably a good thing, unless TV and movies somehow become a little more like inclusive and accurate about different sexual and reproductive health information. Social media seems like the clear winner. And I'm going to pull up the chat because we also have several folks who are responding other, and I would love to know kind of what are some of those other ways. Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah, great point, Jordan, about how things have shifted over time. Yeah, high school and college. We have that is so, it's so true. And
we
that
wondered
is some, yeah.
if that was going to be a response. Yeah, like sex ed.
Yeah.
That would make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. People at work colleagues. All right. Give folks like 10 more seconds to respond to the poll, or if you have any others that we haven't mentioned, to share in the chat. Nice. Podcasts. Yes. Yes, for sure. Yes, Liz, so true. Here in Georgia, sex ed is probably not the best place to get new information about sexual and reproductive health. Wow. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Jordan. I think it really underlines the importance of this conversation that we're having right now about knowledge justice and who even has access to different types of knowledge, and how can we make that more just and more equitable. Mm-hmm. I also appreciated the shout out to Queer Sex Ed podcast. If anybody else has recommendations for like podcasts or other sources of knowledge that they use regularly, we invite y'all to share those in the chat anytime. We're also going to have an opportunity to stay connected after this session. And we really want to have this be sort of like a crowdsourced way that we're sharing resources with each other, because there's so much we can learn from everybody's different experiences and the different tools and resources that we all use to share knowledge. All right, so I'm gonna move back now to the slide presentation. Sorry, I'm gonna pause this screen share right quick to get it back. And while we are pulling up the slides, I actually want to check in with the group. The next part of this we had originally planned as kind of breakout rooms, and I wanted to check in with y'all. We have a small enough group that we could do this interactive session just as a large group. We have about 15 people on the call. What are folks' preferences? Do you want to do this in kind of small, about 5-person breakout rooms, or would you prefer to just have us all stay together and do the interactive piece as a large group? Just share in the chat your preference, breakout room or big group. Cool. Stay together. Okay, great. Then we will do this part as a big group. So, all right, can everybody see the slide again? Great. So instead of splitting into breakout groups, we're going to do this all together. And what we want to learn from you all is the answers to a few questions. What for you makes it easier to get new information, or what are facilitators to getting new information? What maybe makes it a little more difficult to get information, and barriers that stand in your way to learning new knowledge about sexual and reproductive health? And then how do you decide if new information is actually trustworthy? And what we wanted to do to answer these questions is use this tool called a Google Jamboard, which if you are not familiar, it's a way to add answers on sticky notes. So we have some examples here, but I'm gonna just demonstrate so you click sticky note, and I'm gonna answer how I decide if information is trustworthy. So for me, one thing that is really important is the trustworthiness of the source, i.e., is it somebody that I know, and have they given trustworthy or valid information in the past? So I type in my answer, I hit save, and then I'm going to move that into this area. So here is the link. I'm going to share it with everybody in the chat and invite you all to start thinking about this, and then go to the Jamboard and add your answers. I see folks joining. Awesome.
Katie, could you show us how to create a new post-it just in case?
Yes. So see this icon over here on the left side with the little sticky note, which I'm hovering over? You click this, you type your answer. So something that makes it easier to get new information is if a source of information is like open source or free, which building on what someone had said in the barrier section, is that paywalls are a huge barrier. So then once you hit that, you move it over to your section. Mm-hmm.
Also, can I just say how much I love the animal names that Google Sheets uses?
Yes. Yes. Yes, we have a gopher, an armadillo, a jackal, hamster, Nyan cat. Is that what I'm not familiar with that one? Cool. Yes, libraries, free resources. That one is super resonant because my best friend and my mother-in-law are both librarians. So information access through public libraries is a big part of my life. Yes, and I love the Libby app. That has been so useful during quarantine. It is a free app from public libraries where you can check out ebooks. So that has been so useful to me during quarantine when I want to check out new books from the library, but have not been able to in person.
Oh, great addition in the chat. That basically if you have multiple sources of that information, that is a huge way that we determine whether it's a trustworthy bit of information. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm seeing some themes, especially in facilitators and barriers. Financial resources are a big theme. So when information is free, like in a library, like in an open source journal, like in a news source that doesn't have a paywall, that makes it a lot easier to get new information versus things that are paywalled or not available for free. Also, language barriers, both in terms of jargon, I think. Also thinking about even like English versus other languages that information is available in, and information overload and burnout too. Yes, that is so true. Just given kind of going back to that comment that Jordan made earlier as well about how our sources of information have changed, I think along with that has come really an abundance of information that it makes it really difficult to sort through. And that's where I think that piece about deciding how information is trustworthy really comes into play. Like thinking about, as this person wrote, who created the information, what is their goal, whether it's backed up by sources that you trust or whether it occurs kind of in multiple sources. And as someone else wrote, if the source cited other sources, right, exactly, that like, is it sort of confirmed by multiple avenues that you trust? I think that's a big thing. Yeah, great point. Fear of being shamed for not knowing. I think that really goes back to what Liz was talking about how knowledge replicates different power structures, right? That people who have access to knowledge can use that as a tool to make others feel like shame or oppression for not knowing things, or for having a different type of knowledge than maybe is considered like mainstream. These are incredible answers. Thank you all so much. I do want to be mindful of time just because we have a couple other sections to go through. So I hope that these help you sort of think about yourself as a consumer of information. How do you kind of go about it, right? How are things easy for you? What are things that stand in your way? How do you decide if things are trustworthy? And then now we kind of want to move into, once you have acquired some new information, when you've consumed new knowledge, how do you then become a producer of information? How do you share that knowledge? So we're going to go back to the slide deck. And we had a discussion slide that we were going to come back kind of after breakout rooms. Are there any other just final pieces that folks want to share in terms of consuming knowledge before we move on to the next section?
I just want to acknowledge the comment that I think was tied to what the last one that you highlighted, Katie, about shame. Yes, a lot of the overlaps here. So just highlighting another one, someone mentioned the narratives that people use. So we've been having a lot of conversation lately in research space, but I also think much broader about blame narratives, which some of our colleagues who've been involved in this conference, like Zoe Julian, and maybe not at this conference, but Monica McLemore and others have highlighted like how some of the research has done mother blaming of Black mothers who are subject to adverse maternal and child health outcomes more than other groups. And rather than using narratives that place the blame on the folks who are experiencing those health outcomes, what about the larger systems that we live within and the many isms that birthing people are subject to, whether it be racism, whether it be forms of, I noticed that someone noted the heteronormativity and other, like sexism, certainly other isms that people are experiencing, not only in birthing spaces, but certainly in so many other forms of sexual and reproductive health care. And so how are we as producers of knowledge, and then, which we'll get to next, but if the information that we're consuming holds those narratives, I fully agree that's a huge barrier to our trusting those sources of information. So huge nod to that one too.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Whitney, and thank you to the group for such an incredible discussion. As Liz said in the chat, I completely agree. So much wisdom, so much knowledge in this group, and it really is a privilege to get to learn from y'all. And now we're going to continue learning from y'all, and I'm going to shift it over to Whitney to go through the next information pathway as an information producer.
Okay, so I think we just want to talk a bit more about how you all may see yourselves as contributing to the relative production of information as opposed to, well, actually looking at both sides. Where do you see yourselves maybe as producers and or as consumers of information? So our next activity seeks to highlight that. We're going to think about where we each place ourselves on a spectrum. And I think, do you have the link there? Thank you, Katie. We're going to share this in the chat that we've been using, and I'll copy it from there to share in the HOPA app as well. But basically what you're going to do is place yourselves on this. Well, yeah, you're already there. I guess everyone could just click over to page 2 as Katie just demonstrated visually for you. So you really don't have to open the link unless you haven't yet. And think about where you see yourselves in terms of consumption and production. We have 4 quadrants here. So you could see yourselves as not producing much information or consuming much at all in the lower left side, or as perhaps consuming a lot, but not necessarily seeing yourselves in a producing role on the top left. And you can feel free to use the same practice that we've been using by dropping a sticky note in any of those quadrants. And feel free, if you want to use your name, great. If you prefer to use a nickname or initials, feel free to do that. And we're just curious about, where as a whole, we in this group see ourselves. Thank you. I see folks starting to chime in there. Yep. And I do not have to drop that link in the HOVA app because Liz already did that. So thank you. So generally as a group, it seems like most folks are seeing themselves definitely commonly see ourselves as high consumers of information for sure, but there's quite a range in terms of whether people see themselves as also producers of information, though most people seem to be falling either in the middle or more so to the right on that spectrum. It might have been interesting if we also asked whether folks consume the information that we produce, because I think that's a whole nother story. Like we could be adding lots of information to public spheres, but whether or not, or different spheres, whether it be in our professional lives, or perhaps you see yourself as Katie mentioned, produce information for other family members to consume. We certainly know that that does not necessarily mean that people consume that information in that context, but it looks like we all have a variety of different experiences with this.
I just want to say I'm not surprised that this group sees ourselves as high knowledge consumption. I feel like there's a bit of selection bias of folks who are at this conference who are interested in learning new things. So it's really cool to kind of see where everyone falls and that we all see ourselves as consumers of information.
Completely agree. And some folks are adding the specific context in which they see themselves as consumers versus producers, whether it be as a student, as a researcher, or in the capacity of their work in other ways. Yeah. And Sophie noted in the chat, just she, as she thinks about her different consumption roles, she sort of moves herself because she may be more of a consumer in certain roles of her life than others. And I think that made me think about someone's comment in an earlier practice about, or earlier exercise about just the degree to which we may also be overwhelmed with different knowledge consumption. And I imagine in the current different forms of knowledge consumption. And I imagine in the current context, this might be even more so, given that there may be just even more use and just leaning on social media and other forms of information sharing via the internet in our current context can be quite overwhelming. So yeah, this is definitely something to think about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a great question.
I think just to be a little mindful of time, I realize we're already at 12:07, so because this conversation has been so incredible.
We appreciate being able to engage with you all around each of these topics. So we may have to decide how much of the last two poll activities we want to delve into. But we can at least start perhaps with just another poll question that we have for you all in terms of how you communicate information to your network. So all you have to do is either go back to that Poll Everywhere link that you saw before, or you can, maybe if you still have that page up, refresh, it should show this new poll. And just take a few moments to think about how you communicate information to your networks and communities. Is it in the same ways that you consume information? Or is it in different ways and spaces? And feel free to drop in the chat how you see yourself as doing so. Now, granted, some of us see ourselves as low producers of information, so this may take some more thinking for some of us, but as we discuss, there are many spaces in which we may be producers of information, whether it's professionally or personally. And we're starting to see responses come in. Thank you all. So we see that folks see themselves as communicating information to their networks through social media. I think that word may have gotten separated. Text information to their networks. Email is certainly coming up. Social media, again, seems to be the largest word indicating that that it's again most common, but email is growing still. And then conversations. I'm glad to know that, like whether one-on-one or in group, conversations still matter as a source of information sharing. I think these days we wonder to what degree that's still as relevant. This is great. Well, given the short time, I think we can move to the next and I believe last one of these polls in which we're asking, oh, okay, so these are facilitators.
We had two, but maybe we could ask just folks to share in the chat.
Yeah, let's do that. So we covered this first one via poll everywhere. What do you see as facilitators to communicating information? Feel free to answer either of these. We know there are two sides of the same coin often. So what are facilitators or barriers to communicating information that come to mind for you all? And we can use the chat for this one for sake of time. Yeah, so it sounds like for Sophie, having actual conversations is helpful. So I'm going to put that in the facilitator box, because a two-way street, as opposed to, as Liz said, as opposed to just sprouting information in one direction, is often perhaps more of a generative way of producing knowledge. Yeah, yes. So many yeses to Jordan's comment about taking a look at the language that's being used. Basically, how is the information being delivered? So is it jargon heavy? Is it shaming or judging? It is a huge barrier to the sharing of information. And as Leanne shares, trust facilitates information communication, is in fact probably required. And I think Jordan's comments are wrapped into or related to this comment about trust, because it certainly doesn't inspire trust for me when I feel that information that's being shared is judgmental. And I think empathetic information as a facilitator, as Hannah shared. So is the person in this conversation also listening? So is the person who's communicating information also willing to understand, have empathy around what the topic of discussion is? We're seeing trust and empathy being echoed here. Being on the same page helps. These are excellent points. So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to stop this set of reflections, but I think we've seen a lot of themes around trust, empathy, or on the other side, judgment, as being facilitators, and then barriers to information sharing, in addition to the comments early on about whether it's a two-way street. So we can move along. Thank you all for being willing to be so engaged in this conversation. So we may or may not have time. I'm going to look at what these last two questions, maybe we'll move on to the next one, Katie. What do we think needs to be done? What do we need to invest in? What do we need to do to actually achieve knowledge justice, considering some of the conversations that we had today? I believe what I'm hearing in a lot of our conversations is, the messenger matters, in part, is what I'm hearing, because we need to have folks at the table, and as we are sharing our sexual and reproductive health information, that are able to communicate in a way that is non-judgmental, empathetic, not filled with jargon. But also, it sounds like we need to make sure that we are doing the work among ourselves as producers of sexual and reproductive health information, to make sure that we are sticking to those requirements, really, as was so well said by Leanne, of knowledge production in sexual and reproductive health. Are there any other thoughts on that before we move to our closing slides? So Isabella shared that trust, respect, empowering community, the community that the topic pertains to, are necessities to achieve knowledge justice. And Jordan shared that understanding privilege and as people or persons who um, already have trust with the facts or information as opposed to those who don't. Thank you, Jordan. Any other thoughts? Because we are unfortunately out of time, we want to end with a few items. So one is a number of resources for deepening learning around knowledge justice or research justice specifically, which certainly we've highlighted as related concepts. And so some of these include resources for accessing scientific information that is public, that is not behind a paywall, as we saw as a key barrier to taking in information, scientific information. We also want to include a book on research justice and research justice methodologies is linked from these slides, as well as a PCORI training that's available to folks, whether you are at an institution that provides this sort of training for research that is often behind huge paywalls. They've really made more accessible resources for getting involved and engaged in the research process. And then we include other resources for research justice, shifting power in the context of research. And Katie dropped a link in the chat. Do you want to say more about that, Katie, for opportunities to continue the conversation and sharing of information with you all?
Yes, absolutely. So the link that I dropped in the chat is a Google form that we created. If you're interested in continuing this conversation and staying connected with us, we invite you to click that Google Forms link, share your name and contact information, like your email address, and we can follow up after the session with this list of resources, as well as we continue to work in this space, other opportunities to connect and engage. We will also share the Google form link in the Whova chat. So if you want to revisit this session page and follow up and connect there, that will be available. And what I will also do after the session wraps up is share each of these individual resource links in the Whova chat so that it is available as an archive for you to come back and see these different resources as you may want to use them in your own work.
Looks like a kid.
And then I guess we invite you to share any final thoughts, questions, wrap up, and as well as stay in touch with us. Our email addresses are up here on the slide. And like I said, if you fill out that Google form, we will also be able to stay connected. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining, for a fantastic conversation, really amazing. We learned so much from you all, and we're really excited to continue this work and hopefully stay connected.
Thank you all.